Bersama gue di YouTube gue adalah dua tamu yang sangat-sangat istimewa. Untuk orang yang sering nonton YouTube gue, pasti tahu bahwa salah satu isu yang dekat dengan gue adalah keinginan untuk mau berdiskusi, untuk mau ketemu, datang dengan pemikiran sendiri, ketemu dengan pemikiran yang berbeda, kemudian ketemu kesepakatan. Sesuatu yang harus diakui agak jarang terjadi di Indonesia karena mereka, atau banyak orang Indonesia lebih senang merasa benar ketimbang menjadi benar. Dan menjadi benar itu butuh argumen. Kadang-kadang resikonya adalah kita salah. Nah hari ini kita datang tamu spesial, tapi mohon izin, gue akan ganti bahasa ke bahasa Inggris karena tamu gue adalah tamu sangat spesial. With me right now are two very special person. On my far left is Bo Seo, a two-time world debate champion. It is an honor to have you here, Bo.
It's a huge pleasure for me to be here.
Thank you so much. And also, the person who, without her, this is never going to happen. The idea of us sitting together and also publishing this book right here by Bo was helped by Kristi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Kristi is from Eduquip. We're going to talk about that later. But right now, we are going to talk a lot about this book that Bo wrote, Good Arguments, menguasai seni, mengutarakan pandangan untuk hidup dan karir yang lebih memuaskan, which is very interesting because Bo has his own arguments of why having an argument is important. And being a two-time world champion says a lot. And I think we're going to dive in about Eduquip, but also about you. I'm very sorry. In Indonesia, I don't really think there's a prominent debate championship. Do we?
We actually do have a...
I'm not well educated on that. We do? I didn't know this.
We do. So every year, actually, the Ministry of Education sends the national team to World Schools Debating Championship, the one that Bo won. And we actually hosted one in Bali in 2017.
I don't know about this.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for you to join.
Yeah,
Probably will. Probably going to lose. And so, you get to know Bo from
yeah,
the
we met there.
Because
So
you were part of the meeting that we're hosting.
Yeah, so I was a debater myself when I was in high school and university. And then back in 2015, I was a national team coach.
Cool.
Yeah, and then the government decided to host WSTC in Bali. So they asked me to join their team.
Prior to meeting Bo at the competition, are you well aware of how good Bo is in terms of, because maybe the reputation precedes him?
Yeah. So he's a little older than me, just a bit. So he's like 1-2 years older than me. So I believe that my seniors talked about him because he just won the World Schools Debating Championship in 2013, right? Turkey. So I've watched a couple of his videos back then before we met. Like we became good friends.
Probably in another universe, in the multiverse, I would also be a part of the debate team.
Yeah.
Most
I think it sounds like you do debate
Yeah.
some days.
Yeah, no, he gives the vibes, right? Like,
It's not that I like to do, it's not like I like to argue. I just like to win.
Who doesn't?
Yeah, but it's interesting. So you were two-time world debate champion. The first was in
2013. That was the World Schools Championship. So I was a high school debater representing Australia. And then in 2016, I was debating for the Harvard team at the universities level, and we won that championship. And I should add, Kristi is being very modest. She ran as a fairly young person, what's considered one of the most successful World Schools tournaments, and a mark of its success was just how integrated it was into Indonesian society and how much of the society we got to see, how much of the values of diversity and unity, how much that came through in the way in which we understood the competition. So that's where our conversation began.
Yeah, that's a very good point to put out, because being a champion in debate in Indonesia kind of says a lot because of the diversity. Yeah, that's very hard. But so because I am not well educated on debate championship, how is the how is it? How is the debate championship was like? What's it like? I have no idea.
Yeah, so a competitive debate is a kind of a stylized competition, right? So it's for people who like winning, although usually you will kind of lose. Because, and you'll see when I explain it, at the high school level, it's a national competition, kind of like the World Cup. So it's about 50 countries all debating, and it becomes knockout, right?
Yeah.
So each team is given a topic, right? So it could be something like that we should all be vegetarian, let's say. One team says yes, the other team says no. And each speaker has to present arguments and respond to the arguments of the other side. And you're assigned those positions. So you don't know which side you're going to be until it could be an hour before, however long you have to prepare. And then you go through this competition. At the universities level, it's 500 teams from the best universities all around the world, including universities from Indonesia. And over the course of about 7 to 10 days, people fly in from all over the world to argue with one another. And this is, a source of fun and community and dialogue. And importantly, it becomes a source of lasting relationships. So that made me think, this community has worked out something, which is arguments that are usually the worst part of everyone's day, that breaks up relationships, that ruins your mood. This is a community that has oddly found a way to build itself around that and see in it a source of fellow feeling, of community, of mutual recognition. And I thought that might have something to say to the world.
That's a very interesting perspective. People walk away from arguments thinking that it's going to break people apart. And then here's a competition that unites people because of having arguments. Interesting. And I understand you now with Eduquip is helping Bo to publish this book with Gramedia here. Tell us a little bit about Eduquip. Just so that people know the context.
Yeah. So basically, I started out as a debater myself, right? So I have a lot to thank debating because it really molded me to the person I am today, because I learned how to listen, I learned how to engage in a productive discussion with people. And then I realized, having lived in Indonesia most of my life, a lot of the people here don't have the concept of this open discussion with a lot of people. It's especially Mas Pandji, I think we're very diverse, right? Like languages, religion, ethnicities. We are probably one of the most diverse nations in the world. And I kind of wanted to contribute to create a young generation that is more aware on how to be critical, but also have smart arguments that are fruitful, not just shout at each other, or the other way around is that you just stop and not having the discussion at all. So what Eduquip does is that we actually, it's an education company. So we teach a lot of kids from secondary to high school and universities, the 21st century skills. So creative writing, critical thinking, computational skills, all of these things that we usually don't get at school, right? Which I learned a lot through debating. And I kind of wanted to just expand that impact in Indonesia.
I see. This is very interesting. I really want to say, without seeming like I'm hard selling, but especially here in Indonesia, I think the book is really needed. And let me explain why. I'm doing this festival, right? The Hiduplah Indonesia Maya Festival. And one of the genesis of it is the idea that if you live in a country, thousands of islands, the consequences is to build bridge.
Yeah.
Yes.
Here, a lot of people sometimes without even knowing it, they decide to build walls instead of,
Yeah.
and the bridge is dialogues. And within the dialogue, sometimes argument happen. But unless the people from this island, crosses the bridge to meet with people in this other island, there's never going to be understanding.
Yeah.
And without understanding, most probably there's going to be fear. When you fear something you don't understand and you're not familiar with, like every cold places in your house because you rarely go to, like the attic or the basement, you're scared of it. It's only because you're not familiar with it, because you don't do a lot of activities there.
Yeah.
And because you're unfamiliar with it, you're afraid. And when you're afraid, you hate. And when you hate, suffering. I got that from Yoda, Star Wars. So we need to find a way to add skills to a lot of Indonesian people in terms of how to have good arguments. And I'm interested in trying to understand why you decide to write the book, because you can not write the book. You're a 2-time world champion.
That's true.
That's an amazing accomplishment. With the accomplishment, things are just going to be pretty well for you, especially living in Boston, right?
That's true. You can always choose not to write the book, and even while I was on contract to write the book, I was sometimes not writing.
But then what pushes you to write it?
So let me say, first of all, I loved how you framed that in terms of the walls creating fear, but it's really reinforcing fear, because what makes us put up the walls in the first instance is fear, right? So for me, the starting place of this book was the fear that I felt in disagreeing, right? So I had moved from South Korea to Australia when I was 8 without speaking English. And I was one of the handful of Asian kids at the school. And so showing myself at all through speech was scary, but showing myself in difference was particularly scary, right? And what that led me to was a position where I just wanted to agree with everybody, right? To be known as the good guy who smiles and nods and gets along with everyone. And what I came to realize after that period in my life was my relationships were much more shallow. My contact with the world was limited. And I was letting go parts of myself that were real, but that were inconvenient. And it was all of those things that made me who I was. And it was only in debating where the promise was when one person speaks, no one else does, where there's that promise of attention, of silence. That made me find my voice, right? So that overcoming of the fear of difference that you spoke about, I think is really at the core of what I'm trying to address. And as you say, how do we get over that fear? One part of it is you need the skills, right? So you need something you can fall back on. So it's not just an instruction, me saying, go out and speak up. How do I do that, right? And the great thing about debating is it's a set of skills that's been developed over a very long period of time, but that has been made easy enough for people to understand. And we know this because kids do it, right? It's not for kind of the geniuses and the eggheads of the world. It's for people who are willing to invest in disagreement as a craft. So to answer the question about how and why did I do it, one part of it was profound gratitude for what this activity did for me, which was to give me a voice. And my thought that I could hopefully, by introducing people to those skills, contribute to a society in which more people feel empowered to say what's on their mind. That was one part of it. The other part, I have to be honest, was the political context. So I was a university student in 2016 at Harvard in the United States when the Trump-Clinton presidential cycle and debates were happening, right? When I saw the divisiveness of that political moment. And it was a time that made clear to me that the great challenge facing democracies will be, how do we talk about our differences? How do we manage our differences and make it work for us rather than against us? And it was in hoping to say something positive and practical and useful in that moment that made me return to the desk again and again.
That's very interesting. On your part, the idea of not saying your mind comes from self-awareness of I just want to be comfortable. I just want to be accepted, right? So it really comes from you. Whereas in Indonesia, and this is going to lead to a question for you. In Indonesia, the idea of not having the debate is not so that there's peace, but because there's so many, Indonesia's, it's just crazy diverse, right? And when you're very different, you tend not to talk because you don't want to offend people. And you tend not to speak your mind out because the chance of being misunderstood is huge. And so, because we just want to live life peacefully, that it's a collective thing. Would you say, right? So that it kind of, to my point, Indonesians really need to read this book because culturally we're told so many times, just, don't have arguments, just live. Don't you think, right?
Yeah, I think you actually portrayed really well, Mas. I think one thing that I learned a lot through debating, and I carry it on until my adult life, is that debate actually taught me a lot about empathy. Because I was assigned to argue on behalf of groups of people that before I knew debating, I would have bad stereotypes about. So for example, I grew up in a family that is very open. We discuss a lot of things during dinner and everything. And as someone who's young, right, Gen Z / millennials, I think obviously I'm more towards the left in terms of political leaning. I thought oh yeah, Republican is just a bunch of really evil people. That was what I thought, right? But then because of debating, there was a moment where I had to actually research about Republicans and what they're standing for. And that kind of got me to think a lot about how, turns out, if you really wanted to know the world, right, you have to look at things from different perspectives and not just straight down and say that, the other side is so bad and I don't want to know what you want, because this definitely, what you said, building walls, right? But through debating, and as an Indonesian as well, I noticed that obviously I've had a couple of stereotypes that slowly but surely debating helped me to erase. So for me, the reason why I really wanted this book to also be here in Indonesia is because it is a personal calling for me to see more Indonesian having discussions openly. For example, Mas, I think as a Japanese, for example, when you talk to someone, I have a lot of Batak friends because I went to law school, right? Sometimes when I talk to them, I was wait, why are you shouting? And they're no, I'm not shouting. I'm but you are shouting, right? So I was that kind of small little, occurrences really taught me that, wow, we're really, really diverse. And the only way that we can actually have an open discussion, which is fruitful, and it happens not only in the level of the society, but also I would love to see one day we're gonna have a better presidential debate, for example, which I mean,
unlikely though.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, we're getting there. Maybe with this book, maybe they would read the book, right?
Yeah.
Maybe there's still that hope in me, so I really wanted to. Yeah, I really want people to understand that debate is not something negative, right? It is a process to reach an outcome that is supposed to be fruitful for everyone. Yeah.
So let's try to learn something without revealing too much from the book. What makes a good argument from your point?
Yeah. The beginning point is, as Kristi says, listening, right? It's listening out for where it is that the other person is coming from. It's also about hearing yourself and why it is that you think what you do, and asking yourself questions that help you flesh out what it is that you're trying to communicate. So in debating, you're taught that every argument has to do two things. One is you have to show that the claim that you're making is true. And second, that the claim that you're making is important, that it should change the other person's mind. So I'll give you an example. So if the argument that you're making is that we should all be vegetarian because it's good for the environment, the first thing you're going to have to do is to show that being vegetarian is actually good for the environment, because otherwise you're not going anywhere. And the second is you're going to have to show the fact that it's good for the environment gives us enough of a reason to go vegetarian, as opposed to preferring personal enjoyment, family tradition. This is what we've always done, right? So that's just an example of how a debater thinks about an argument, not just as anything that comes to your mind, any collection of emotions, a repetition of all the things you believe. It comes from listening to yourself, asking yourself questions, and listening as if you were not someone who was on your side already, right? As if you were someone who needed convincing, and spelling out your thinking, walking through the listener in a way that will help them understand where you're coming from and ultimately come around to your perspective. So the building block of a disagreement is an argument, and that's how a debater makes one.
That's very interesting. As you were speaking, I kind of feel like a lot of comedians, that's exactly the thought process of comics when they're trying to, because comics, when they go on stage, they say things that people see but didn't really realize. And then there's a lot of thought-provoking jokes that try to, to challenge the norm. And one of the ways to do it is you have to have good arguments within the joke, because otherwise people won't be, be on the boat, and you can't bring them places joke-wise. You can't make them laugh unless they get the point of the argument, which is very interesting. And in Indonesia, a lot of comics have thought-provoking. It's not really thought-provoking. It's just that we're just kind of, what's the word when you want to say something like you're late, like everybody else is advanced and then you're not.
You're left behind?
Yeah, we're left behind in a lot of things. It's because the thing that comics are trying to convey or to put out there, it's just normal things elsewhere. Where in Indonesia, you just really have to argue. Like, for instance, every Christmas, there's always going to be a huge debate social media whether Muslims are allowed to say Merry Christmas. Yeah. And it's the non-stop. It's never ending. Like, it's so weird. Elsewhere, this is not an issue, right? People in the US are flying, like Elon Musk is flying to the moon, and we're still arguing and, things like this. But this is also why, I guess maybe the reason why those kind of arguments keep recurring is because we've never had a really good argument on the subject.
Yeah.
I think there's two really interesting points there. So one is, in that framework that I gave, so one shorthand debaters have for making good arguments is to say the 4 W's, right? Mm-hmm. What is the point you're making? Why is it true? When has it happened before? Can you give me an example? And who cares? Why should it change your mind? And the important thing about that last question, to your point, is it's not really about the speaker. It's actually about the listener, right? So there's the work that you have to do as an arguer, maybe as a comic, as a performer, of sorting out what you want to say. But ultimately, it's about how do you make it connect for the other person. And so it reaches towards the listener, yeah, right? From the speaker to the listener. And I think that's related to the second point that you made about these conversations that tend to recur, right? So one of the reasons why we need listening, one of the reasons why we need good arguments is so that we can progress.
Yeah.
We can progress. And a sign of an excellent argument for me is you think A, someone thinks B, but through the process of conversation, we can encounter C and D and E, right? We can see there are options that we had not considered before. And I think that's the kind of creativity that's a sign of us moving forward in the discussion.
But to your point, there's a lot of things that individuals need to have in order to be able to do that. Like empathy, Kristi was pointing out empathy. In order for me to know how to make it interesting for you to want to listen, I have to understand you.
Yeah.
And then once I understand you, then I know how to get you, right? I get to you. And empathy it's another thing, because without life experiences, it's kind of hard to develop empathy and also logic. So maybe I'm going to ask Kristi first. Which one do you think is more important, if any? Having empathy so that you can get your point across, or having logic on the person across to, understand your point?
I think both are equally important, and it should complement each other. I think to echo what you said and like what Bo said as well, I wanted to add, like, in making like good arguments, it's really important for us to understand that debate, not just debate, discussion is about how do you get your story across, right? So it's all about storytelling. Like you were saying that we were left behind. I totally agree with that, because now I think for example, when Elon Musk, he wanted us to invest in his project to go to Mars. He has to build a good story about it, right? Like, why now? Why is it important? Why do you have to trust me while I'm making that decision, right? Or let's say with the whole bandwagon of cryptocurrency, right? It's a concept that, probably 20 years ago, we would laugh about it, but now a lot of people are investing in it. Why? Because it's the story, right? So I'm a huge fan of like Yuval Noah Harari as well, where he talked a lot about this. The importance of, conveying your story to make it more acceptable by the other side. It's very important, especially Indonesia is very diverse. So it's like, if I have a story to tell, you might not understand it because you grew up in a different household, right? In a different culture. But through debating, you learn about how to, build a story that is interesting, that makes sense logically, like what you said, but at the same time also has a lot of like empathy as its element, because you don't want to offend people with your case. You don't want to say that, oh, I think you're wrong, and there you go, the religion card, identity card that we have seen a lot in Indonesia and all like election cycle, which is very sad. So I think it has to go like hand in hand, because without empathy, there's no logic that actually makes sense for people to accept. But like without logic, then people would be like, yeah, you're just being naive, you're just being stupid. You get what I mean? Yeah.
So Bo, what do you think is the biggest, let's not say biggest, the common mistake people do while trying to have good argument? Because it's not helping anything if we offend this person, we can't really get an agreement on certain matters. So what do you think is the most common mistake people do when trying to establish good arguments?
I think they jump into a disagreement without thinking about it. I think that's the biggest mistake.
Say no just for the sake of.
And also, disagreeing for me is like a kind of a fire, right? It's incredibly powerful. It's a force for generating truth, for generating new ideas, for showing yourself, revealing yourself to one another in a really kind of intimate, private way. But it needs to be managed because it can go out of control. So one of the things that you learn in debating is that every debate should start with some agreement, right? That's agreement about what it is that we're talking about, first of all. And many discussions don't even have that, right? So one person thinks this is a disagreement about who's going to wash the dishes or who's going to clean the laundry. And the other person thinks it's actually a debate about your commitment to the relationship, right? They think there's some symbolic significance here. And you're talking past one another, right? One person thinks it's just at the level of the chores. The other person thinks it's at the level of the relationship. So before jumping into the disagreement, agreeing about what it is that we're actually talking about, right? Then agreeing about how it is that we're going to have the discussion. So we're going to have roughly equal time so that not one person is dominating the conversation. We're not going to interrupt one another, but we are going to give the other person a chance to respond, right? So I have a go, you have a go, but I get to come back. So I don't have to interrupt you on the spot, right? So I think having that conversation about conversations, sometimes argument about arguments, so we know the kind of disagreement we're about to have, I think that work can be really important. So to your point earlier about having to know something about the other person in order to make an argument connect with them, that seems really true to me. And the takeaway for me for that is, before jumping into a disagreement, perhaps taking the time to ask a few questions. Right? Why is it that you care about this so much? How did you come to believe this? And once you have that set of common understanding, once you have that agreement about the kind of conversation we're going to have, then saying, is it okay if we disagree about this?
Yeah.
Right? So slowing it down and being deliberate, I think, can help solve some of those problems.
You know, Bo, I think you're not just going to help the country. I think you're going to help this company. Just because just before you guys came, I was having a huge argument with people in this company, because I think one of the best, to me especially, because I'm just having an argument before this, one of the things that it really resonates to me is, before we start an argument, we have to start with an agreement or something. We have to agree on something. That's very important. It's kind of simple, but it didn't really dawn on me. And so that's why I believe your book is going to help not just the nation, probably this company.
Which is more important, right?
We can talk hours about this, but I know my audience very well. It's just not going to help them up above 30 minutes. So thank you very much. You guys are going to have a launch on this book on August 2nd.
So in 2 days, it's going to be available in all Gramedia stores or in Indonesia. Yeah. So
you have is there going to be like an event or something?
There's actually a grand launching at the Faculty of Law, University of Indonesia. Bo is going to be there, and we're going to be joined by Pak Gita Wirawan as well. And also Professor Amin from Kemendikbud. Yeah, so we really hope that this event would basically kind of become.
So have to register?
It's a free event, so you just have to register or just come. Basically, we have like a huge space. I think one thing that I wanted to also say, Mas Pandji, I think a great nation is a nation that is not afraid to think critically, and you have to do that, and it has to start from the groundwork. You cannot have great leaders without people that push them to actually help them, like it's no longer about your identity, my party or whatever, but the vision that we have to agree on something, what Indonesia wants to do. Like we always talk about Indonesia Emas 2045, but no one really talked about how do we get there, right? So it's important. Now I think we have to agree first. What do we want in the next 10, 20 years? Have some disagreements in the process, have a wonderful outcome. And you can learn that from this book.
I think we can all agree that in the future we would like to have a Taylor Swift concert.
Oh yeah, that's amazing. I'm a huge Taylor Swift fan.
Well, thank you very much, Kristi. Thank you very much. The book is going to be ready nationwide August 2nd. And then it would be great if you can just come to the launch event. It would be great. Thank you very much, Bo.
Thank you so much,
Kristi. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.